All right, Chapter 8, Power, Politics, and Identities. So the learning objectives for Chapter 8 are to explain contemporary political identities, evaluate stock sociological theories regarding power, politics, and identity, apply the matrix approach to U.S. political history, and lastly, to formulate alternatives to the matrix of race and politics. Okay, so politics refers to all of the processes, activities, and institutions having to do with governance. Political identities are the political positions based on the interests and perspectives of social groups that people associate themselves with. Across the U.S., these political identities representing race, gender, sexuality, language, region, and class frequently interact and intervene in multiple forms of political expression. Traditionally, our analysis of politics within the United States has stressed single group comparisons. The problem with comparing groups using single indicators is that it fails to capture the complex reality of voting behavior. Intersectionality informs us that political identities are more than just social groups, and that they intersect across multiple dimensions. For example, where you live affects your political views and affiliations generally. So there's regional differences. In the South and the Northeast, right, and rural areas in the South that have high concentrations of minority poverty, the link between white identity, income, and partisanship becomes apparent. They often call the South the Bible Belt or the red states because of the large number of conservative voters. In the Northeast, where large proportions of African Americans reside, voters that live in affluent block areas are only slightly more Republican than those in less affluent block groups. In the West, those states, that you're currently in, that tend to be more liberal and have more Democratic candidates and ideology, interesting though, even in California or anywhere else in the West, the rural areas still remain ultra-conservative, right, all the way up the Pacific Northwest. So while there's general patterns, you cannot completely predict a person's political views or political party affiliation simply by location. It's another factor when you intersect it with race, class, gender, sexuality, age, and others that will give you more complex political identities. For instance, there are gay conservatives, there are religious liberals, and every variation in between. But there are ways in which our politics affect people's lives differently, which can affect political support. So immigration is a wedge issue that affects political ideology, as there are racialized communities associated with immigration in the modern day. And policies can then affect support. So when Trump says Mexicans are rapists and murderers, and that they are not sending their best, that larger racial vitriol and stigma can affect all Latinx, and not just those that are recent immigrants from Mexico. Further, the cruel policy of separating migrant families on the border and detaining children in cages in horrific conditions that will cause lifelong psychological trauma as a result, in order to dissuade people from coming to the border to apply for asylum, which they are in their legal rights to do. So if you see this and the children in the cages have the same skin tone as your babies, it can galvanize you politically to support candidates and parties that support Latinx rights and immigrant rights, or at least those who don't express bigotry towards you specifically. So we often think that politics is something outside or separate or ignorable. But in reality, it's intricately connected to our societal laws, power structures, and definitions of who an American is. We are also the product of our environments, so those around us can influence us immensely, as the majority of people have the same political party affiliation as their parents. Like anything else, we're socialized into viewpoints in this world that are framed in political lenses. But not all people have the same access to politics. Those who run for office need a lot of money, and unless they come from grassroots politics and don't accept corporate money, the overwhelming majority of elected leaders are funded by corporate lobbyists and industries that want breaks in return, like loosening of environmental regulations on clean air for the coal industry and removing regulations on air pollution. The Trump administration is a clear example of this, as Trump has attacked the EPA, has oil industry CEOs like ExxonMobil's Rex Tillerson, who served as his Secretary of State. But beyond running for political office, not all people have the same access to voting. Some people are disenfranchised from voting, and not every vote counts the same way, thanks to political tricks like gerrymandering. So political disenfranchisement is a huge problem in this country. Disenfranchisement is just, basically dissuading or putting laws and policies in place that affect people's likelihood of voting. So laws regulating voter disenfranchisement differ regionally. 7 states disenfranchise less than 0.5% of their population, while 6 southern states disenfranchise over 7% of their population. Among those 7%, Hispanics and African Americans are much more likely to be disenfranchised. In some states, such as Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, the disenfranchisement among African Americans is more than about 20% of the voting population. And that's not counting people with criminal records who are routinely taken off of voting lists because in almost every state across the United States, if you get a felony conviction, you are no longer eligible to vote. So there's 2 states that allow you to vote. Otherwise, most states, it's about 7 to 11 years you can't vote. And in a few states, if you commit a felony there, you can never vote again. So now if you connect it back to what we talked about the disproportionate race of policing and arrest of people of color, then a large proportion of those people that are getting felony arrests are, African Americans, Latinx, or other, immigrants or other racialized groups, which means that, of course, they're going to be less likely to then be able to vote. Another big problem is the interstate cross-check program and voter ID laws. These policies that are put in place to specifically target individuals. Chris Kobach is out there saying millions of people voted illegally. You have all these Fox News people saying the only reason that, or even Trump said it, that, in the 2016 election, that the reason that Hillary got 3 million more votes than him was because there was all these undocumented immigrants voting and all of these people voting twice, like you go into your polling place, you vote, then you walk outside, you put on a fake mustache and a hat, and you go back in and vote again. It's like the stupidest thing because there's no evidence. There's literally zero evidence. When you talk about how many people have been prosecuted for voting illegally, the need for these voter ID laws, there's just no evidence at all. And so it's actually kind of ironic, especially when it comes to Trump himself, voting illegally from a place that wasn't his residence in Florida, or his daughter being registered in 2 places, his son-in-law, all of these kind of things. Those are actual violations of how voting works. But, when you come to interstate cross-check program, hundreds of thousands of people were knocked off of the eligible voting list based on the idea that they voted in multiple states. And as the research on that particular program shows, this disproportionately affected people of color, especially Asian last names, Latinx last names, and Black last names, right? As you can see in the film, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Other intersectional aspects of political identities are associated with how race and income interact. An inverse relationship exists between income and education, and non-voting. The highest levels of non-voters are associated with the lowest levels of education and income. While higher levels of income seem to be associated with higher likelihood of voting, the same does not correspond with higher levels of education. For education, the likelihood of voting is mixed across various levels. So being eligible to vote and voting are 2 different things. When it comes to voting patterns, we have a very 2-party system in the United States. And Democrats have traditionally relied upon an alliance of identity groups, typically Black voters and northern white voters, right? Or what they call, the people on the coasts. This alliance accounted for the victory of the first Black man, Barack Obama, to win the presidency of the United States in 2008. Obama easily won a second term with tremendous support from Black voters. It also didn't hurt that the guy running against him was a billionaire. Anyway, on the flip side, Republican support in the South, Midwest, or what some call the Bible Belt, or the flyover states, are also connected to social class, race, and gender, as many conservative leaders appeal to xenophobia when talking about immigration, or racism when ignoring police brutality and killings by using the black-on-black crime talking point, which attracts white voter support. As they're basically saying, if you're facing hardships as a white poor person, it isn't the rich white guy who won't pay you more, that exploits your labor and your rent or your mortgage for profit. It's the Black and brown community taking your job. It's the immigrants, blah, blah, dog whistle politics. So these racist people are motivated to vote for them. It's called the Southern Strategy. It was first employed by Nixon, then Reagan, first and second Bush, and now, to an unparalleled height, with Trump, who used his first official campaign speech to call Mexicans rapists and murderers. He also took Nixon's and Reagan's law and order dog whistle and specifically stole Reagan's campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." So dog whistle politics, what I mean there, these are important to understand as people use race-neutral language like thugs or hoodlums that have racialized perceptions. When you picture a thug in your head, it's racialized. But without dropping N-word bombs, they can claim that they're not being racist. So when we examine the 2016 presidential election, distinct intersectional realities that are associated with race, gender, and education are apparent. It's almost as if two different Americas exist and voted in this polarized election in ways that connect to their identities and their experiences. The election revealed that people with and without college degrees voted very differently. So when it comes to support for Clinton, Clinton garnered 52% of the vote among voters with college degrees, while Trump scored similar support among those without college degrees. Among whites without college degrees was in accord with projections. He obtained about 67% of non-college educated white voters. So Trump also, when it comes to voting patterns and race, he captured 58% of white non-Hispanic vote, while Clinton scored major victories among Black Americans, about 80%. So gender also played a role in the largest gender gap since 1972. Women were slightly more likely at 54% to support Clinton, while more than 53% of men supported Trump. Trump was caught on tape saying that he liked to, and this is his direct quote, grab women by the pussy, because when you're famous, they let you do it. He shrugged it off later as locker room talk, claiming all men talk about women as sex objects, and that his literally confessing to sexually assaulting women can obviously affect female voter support. Also, Clinton was the first major female candidate who was followed around by hecklers who would scream things at Clinton like, "Iron my shirt." You can watch these exchanges on YouTube. It is very disgusting. So some men were threatened by the idea of a female president, or relied on outdated stereotypes to say a woman would be too emotional or bomb countries because she was on her period. These arguments come from a time period when they were used to justify women being legally barred from voting or holding political office. So that's why they're so dangerous. There's so many societal arguments like this that justify inequality as it is. In general, our societal gender roles assume that men are natural leaders and women are natural nurturers. So the Clinton campaign ran on her established experience, as many argued she was one of the most experienced candidates to ever run for president, running against a multiple bankruptcy supposed businessman who was known as the host of a reality TV show, who had never held elected office and overall had an incredibly limited understanding of what the job entailed. I've read a lot of crappy books by his former staffers and others close to the president who argue that he never thought he was actually going to win, so he didn't prepare. He just wanted more name recognition so he could sell his crappy steaks and ties and other garbage. Trump denies this, but 4 separate books have cited sources that say otherwise. So age also plays a factor in political support, and it did in 2016. Young voters age 18 through 29 preferred Clinton over Trump by a wide margin of 53% to 45%. This could be as some youth are more progressive, so more in line with her platform. But for others, it may be about Trump claiming that climate change is a hoax, or not supporting free or affordable college programs that affect many youth. So political support is complex. There are no monolithic groups. When we do the research, though, we do find these significant differences among different social groups in their voting choices. Political sociology is the study of government, political behaviors, institutions, and processes that occur between the state, society, and its citizens. It is the study of power, politics, and identity, how they come together, how they intersect, and how they affect our support for policies, parties, and political candidates. Pluralism is a theory that argues that power within a society is decentralized, that it's widely shared, diffuse, and fragmented. Groups throughout society reflecting business, labor, professions, religion, and culture compete and often hold conflicting interests. Because no single group is dominant, democratic equilibrium is established. So individuals enter groups because they have more power than individuals when it comes to achieving goals. The larger the group, the more influence it will have. The essential democratic function of a political institution is to regulate the conflict among various groups. Multiple forms of conflict can surface along distinct interest groups, so various political elites will be more or less engaged in the political process depending on which interests are prominent. The two types of groups are associated with the pluralistic model: insider groups who hold the majority of the power, and outsider groups who are marginalized and have limited power. Insider groups tend to be well recognized, organized, established, and hold positions of power and prestige within the community. Insider groups may use direct means to affect political outcomes, such as having politicians and processes, such as voting, lobbying, and boycotts. Outsider groups have less access to elected governmental officials and may consist of recent migrants, socially discriminated groups, and special interest groups. So the pluralistic approach assumes the power is dispersed equally among insiders, but in reality, power tends to be concentrated among a very few well-placed insiders. For example, even as women and blacks have become relative insiders over the past 4 decades, they do not equally share the power held by whites and males. Pluralism has limited the ability to actually deal with changing political climates and conditions. The democratic equilibrium that pluralism assumes is often seen as too simplistic and unrealistic. Binary constructs like this approach to normalize and legitimize the racial and gender hierarchies at the expense of the outsiders, like the racial minorities and gender groups. The power elite model suggests that power is concentrated among a discrete group of elites who control the resources of significant social institutions. These elites consist of the holders of the highest political offices, heads of major corporations, and high-ranking military personnel. If you examine U.S. politics, you'll see a lot of circular power within these 3 groups. As CEOs become Secretary of State, as former senators who lobbied for pharmaceutical industry to charge the highest prices for prescription drugs in the world, then go on to be the CEO of pharma. You also see former military officials in powerful political and corporate roles. An example would be former Vice President Dick Cheney, who was the CEO of Halliburton, an oil company that got all the rights to Iraq's oil fields after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It is like an obvious, glaring conflict of interest, but it shows how much power is concentrated with so few. How those making the majority of important decisions are in the elite of these 3 fields. So it's not a shock to find that race, class, and gender connect as well to the elite, as elite politicians, corporate leaders, and military leaders are overwhelmingly white and male. All right, moving on to the class approach. So the class approach model to power assumes that the type of economic system a society has determines the kind of political structures that evolve. In the United States, those who control the economic production control the political processes. According to Marx, the social elites that control the markets control the government, and they in turn dominate other classes to perpetuate their power. Look at how people run for office, how much money they need. Progressive candidates like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, vow to not take money from corporations or lobbyists or to form super PACs. PACs are political action committees that raise money and run ads to support a candidate. But normal PACs have to disclose their donors and follow campaign finance limitations. Super PACs came about thanks to a challenge called Citizens United, which made its way to the Supreme Court and established a precedent that destroyed campaign finance and allowed unlimited amounts of untraceable money to flow into politics. It's an interesting case. The group originally formed when Clarence Thomas was nominated to the Supreme Court, and his former employee Anita Hill came forward with claims that he sexually harassed her in extreme and disgusting ways. For more information, there's a great documentary about this on Netflix called Anita. Anywho, the group Citizens United ran attack ads against her, saying she just wanted to tear a black man down. Mind you, he was running the agency that oversaw sexual harassment while he was sexually harassing employees. And I say plural because later other women came forward, but he was confirmed and is now on the Supreme Court for life. So save that information for a second. The modern Citizens United case involved the group making a movie about Hillary Clinton. when she was running for president, and all these Clinton conspiracy theories that her and her husband murder everyone and other unprovable nonsense. And it violated campaign finance laws. But the appeals went all the way to the Supreme Court. And guess who the deciding vote was? Guess who sided with Citizens United? Clarence Thomas, the guy they fought for decades earlier. So that's crazy enough a story, but no, it's much, much worse than that. How did the case result in unlimited money corrupting politics? That's the cray part. The Supreme Court ruled that corporations are people and have the same rights as people. Now, how the hell does that work? Corporations can't die or go to prison, so they're obviously not people, but legally they get the same rights. Crazy, right? It actually gets worse. Corporations are people now, but how can they have free speech since they don't have faces with face holes? Their speech is considered unlimited amounts of money to candidates, and boom, super PACs were born. So super PACs, they don't have to disclose where their money comes from. And some estimate at least 30% of that money flowing into politics now is actually coming from outside countries, completely circumventing our democratic process. It's very disgusting. So back to Bernie and AOC, they refuse this money because the money comes with strings attached, with expectations for policies in the best interest of corporations and not in the best interest of the health, safety, and prosperity of the real actual human people that vote them into office. Critical race theory aims to transform the relationship between race, racism, and power. It has 3 themes. So one of the central themes of critical scholars is their rejection of stock sociopolitical theories. A second theme is mainstream ideas reflected disproportionately by white scholars stress the importance of linking structural conditions like laws or the economy to the self-interest of leaders, activists, or even regions to understand ethnic identity and the conflict that often occurs. And the third theme is that political realities that reaffirm racial hierarchies are normal. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a critical race theorist, coined the term intersectionality and argued that political processes were best understood through this lens. According to Crenshaw, the experiences people face representing intersecting and interacting spheres that shape structural, political, and representational aspects of our being. And these inequalities that result are not the product of a single one of these dimensions, but the intersection of 2 or more of them. So intersectionality can also be a source of agency and advocacy. This agency is a form of identity politics, which is a political process or structure that relies upon people of specific religions, racial and ethnic groups, or social backgrounds to form political alliances. Since various interests divide people into different classes with radically different objectives and rationales, the principal purpose of government is to regulate these conflicts and ensure that fairness or justice is achieved. The stock story of U.S. politics tells us that the original intent of the U.S. government was to diminish conflict between the haves and the haves-not. The stock story of U.S. politics teaches us our nation is a democracy in which every citizen, regardless of identifying characteristics, has a voice in the political process. A stock story suggesting that inequalities associated with race, class, gender, sexual orientation, or other forms of identity are aberrant and not part of the core values of our culture. Using these stock stories to guide us, we understand that conflicts arise in situations where resources are scarce. So power is defined as the ability to acquire scarce resources, and politics regulates power. If the central role of political institutions is to govern conflict, then it also serves the function of regulating power. Resource scarcity and the power associated with its acquisition are both key to specific historical situations, including settings and geographical locations. So individuals seeking to maximize their access to resources are more likely to organize into groups that are more efficient at resource acquisition. That's why people form unions for labor. One of the most prized resources available in a democracy is freedom. In 1776, when the First Continental Congress met to create a government for our new nation, slaves comprised approximately 20% of the entire population in the 13 colonies. While slavery existed in all of the colonies, political, social, and geographical conditions resulted in distinctly different attitudes toward slavery. Before the Civil War, the southern colonies were staunch supporters of slavery because the entire economy was agricultural and relied on slave labor to exist. Elite landowners found that plantations relying on slave labor could be more profitable and produce crops such as rice, cotton, and tobacco. At the same time, slaves in the northern colonies had more diversified skills. Ultimately, the northern elites determined that free labor was more productive than slave labor. And our current Senate and House of Representatives are a direct result of this conflict, of whether, and how to count slaves as part of the population. The southern delegations with relatively smaller populations wanted slaves to be counted equally to whites to bolster their population and power in the government. The northern states that had considerably larger populations but virtually no slaves were obviously in opposition to that. So the Great Compromise of 1787 was the result of this disagreement. The compromise included two governing bodies, wherein population determined how many seats each state would hold in the House of Representatives, and the Senate would have 2 members from each state. Slaves would count as 3/5 in total when determining representatives, as well as presidential electors and taxes. It's often referred to as a 3/5 compromise. So I'm sure you learned about this in school at some point, but here's the real deal on all of that. It's still problematic, and a lot of our issues of electoral college and all of it comes out of this time period. So basically, the southern states wanted to say that slaves were 3/5 a person so they could count them as people in the state so they could get more taxes and revenue, but they weren't actually going to allow the slaves to actually vote or hold office or have any political power whatsoever. Citizenship reflects the legal process countries use to regulate national identity, membership, and rights. And it also establishes the political boundaries that define who is and who is not included in the democratic franchise. The 1790 Naturalization Act granted citizenship to, quote, free white aliens, end quote, with 2 years' residence, but withheld it from slaves and women. It excluded all non-whites from citizenship. While citizenship was extended to all whites after establishing residency, only property-owning men could exercise the right to vote or hold political office. Native Americans are considered sovereign nationals from the onset of the United States. They were considered independent and held authority over their own citizens and remaining land. The United States signed and ratified over 390 treaties with various Native American tribes. These treaties were formal negotiations regarding the sale of land and property rights owned by the indigenous people, but of course, desired by the United States. So natives did not become citizens of the United States until 1924. U.S. immigration policies were intentional regarding race and tried to preserve white supremacy. Northern free states, with their concentration in both commercial and manufacturing, was a clear choice for immigrants of where to go. In the 1840s, nearly half of all immigrants were from Ireland alone. Between 1820 and 1930, of the approximate 4.5 million Irish, most settled close to their point of arrival in cities across the East Coast. As we discussed, the gold rush also attracted Asian immigrants to the West. And later, almost 5 million German immigrants, also coming in large numbers during the 19th century, settled in the present Midwest as they bought farms and settled near cities such as Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. Many great beer brewers came from these immigrants, and I'm thankful for that. And in 1921, the Emergency Quota Act was adopted, which limited the numbers of immigrants to the United States by imposing quotas based on the country of birth. This wasn't changed until the 60s. And before it was repealed, it basically put a number limit on how many people could come from non-white majority countries. Geography and history interact in particular ways. Over these unique spaces and places, we note that 2 distinct patterns of racial political processes can be identified. The 2 patterns are de jure and de facto. So de jure are political practices and processes enacted as formal laws, while de facto means political practices and processes that, although not enshrined into law, were carried out in practice by various entities. So some post-Civil War de jure laws impacted many aspects of life. Most public spaces segregated people by race, and these new laws raised many restrictions on voting, such as poll taxes, which were a 2-year tax that had to be paid in advance in order to register to vote, which ensured that the poor couldn't vote because they couldn't afford to. There were also literacy tests, which required a person seeking to vote to read and interpret a section of the state constitution to the county court. These were very difficult tests. I have a colleague who works in political science that she has her college juniors and seniors take an established literacy test, and most of them can't pass it. And of course, there were grandfather clauses, the most obvious racialized part of the whole damn thing, that existed and permitted anyone whose grandfather was qualified prior to the Civil War to vote. A nice way of saying if your grandpa was white, you can vote. And again, women could not vote. All of these laws only benefited white citizens. So states in the South and the North passed residential segregation laws. And in 1917, the Supreme Court held that such ordinances were unconstitutional. As a result, real estate agents and private developers began to write their own provisions into real estate contracts, which formed the basis of the post-Civil War de facto practices, using methods like restrictive covenants that barred the resale to purchasers of a race different than the original homeowner, right? So if it was a whites-only deed and they changed the law that you can't say whites only, then you can only sell it to someone with the same race. The Supreme Court in 1948 ruled that these restrictive covenants were unconstitutional, but the damage had already been done, and residential segregation had become entrenched by that point. The Federal Housing Authority reinforced residential segregation, and rules required developers to include restrictive covenants that segregated buildings owned by municipalities. Another process was redlining, right? One of these practices that sorts out areas worthy of mortgage lending and were ranked and color-coded. So the D-rated ones, the ones designated so because they were, quote, inharmonious racial groups, were outlined in red, hence redlining. The term was in use in banks and by the federal government until 1968, and was also used by private banks in the country throughout, as one of its most massive homeownership expansions in history, basically effectively making sure that poor communities of color were locked out of those opportunities to enter the middle class. In many ways, identity politics paved the way to the massive political protest, resistance, and transformation that's associated with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. This period's also distinguished by the fact that coalition politics rose to prominence, not to mention the 70s, which we'll discuss later. So coalitional politics represent political alliances of various identity groups whose purpose is to establish a specific political agenda. Perhaps no single movement captured this new form of politics better than the Black Civil Rights Movement from 1955 to 1968. One of their major victories was the 1964 Civil Rights Act that banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment practices. It also prohibited segregation in school, at the workplace, and in public accommodations. This was followed by the 1965 Voting Rights Act that ended voting discrimination and extended federal protections to minorities. Though I should mention, key portions of this law were altered in the 2000s. One provision of the law said that states who were known to have discriminatory past in voting had to be overseen when they changed the voting laws to make sure they're not harming marginalized groups like racial and ethnic minorities. So when this provision was gutted, several states responded within 1 to 2 years with voter ID laws that disproportionately affect people of color, the poor, and young voters. So social movements' victories, are important in kind of structuring a future that's less adversarial, that's more welcoming and supportive of all groups. So one of those is the Immigration and Nationality Act, which removed racial and national barriers and opened immigration to Black immigrants from Africa and the Western Hemisphere, which didn't happen until the late 60s, and as well as the Fair Housing Act that made discrimination in the sale and rental of housing illegal. So these changes would never have been possible without the tireless efforts of activists and organizers who protested, marched, had sit-ins, teach-ins, die-ins, and other demonstrations, along with boycotts, to make their voices heard and to change the laws from their discriminatory effects. This does not mean there's not housing discrimination anymore, but it means that, in theory, people have legal recourse to sue if their rights are violated. So the United States originated as a consequence of political activism, which has been central to every important phase of our nation's history and continues to guide us in our quest to become a more perfect union. Protests demonstrate that political activism makes a difference, that it can build alternatives to the matrix of race and politics that we see currently. Political activism normally involves various types of actions that go beyond voting and may be as simple as writing blogs, posting on the internet, or getting involved in a letter writing campaign, or as active as participating in a protest. One of the major insights revealed by the intersectional approach is that while race, class, gender, sexuality, and other sites of identity interact to produce unique forms of inequality and discrimination, they can also become the basis of agency, or the ability to affect change, to act independently, and to exercise free choices, right? To kind of form communities around. And social media is an interesting aspect of this as well. As technology has changed and changed the way that we interact with each other, social media is frequently used to draw attention to important social issues. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement originated from a Twitter hashtag and is built into a larger, nationalized, and really worldwide movement. So if we're serious about creating change, then we must be active participants in our democracy. As millennials become the dominant force in the U.S. electorate, it is vital that individuals work together to influence progress. We've seen throughout our history that immigrants have been frequently targeted by both federal and state policies. There's been a long history of political mobilization throughout the country, as various immigration laws and ordinances have been passed at the state and local level. These laws range from bans on Islamic dress, or the Arizona law that I referred to before, SB 1070, that requires all immigrants to carry registration papers. An estimated 60 cities around the country have declared themselves to be sanctuary cities. In these cities, if a person is arrested for driving without a license and then identified as an illegal immigrant, the person must serve time for the state charges or pay stipulated fines. But then they are released, not deported. So if they're committing, nonviolent crimes and, you run a stop sign or something like that, instead of being deported, they just had to pay the fine like everyone else. This movement came about and reflects the growing concerns that Donald Trump as president will force undocumented immigrants who came here as children to leave the country, as he tried to repeal DACA and will not support DAPA, and has instituted the most cruel policies of family separation since the days of Native American re-education boarding schools.